Everyone who wrote to The Tonight Show wanted something from Johnny Carson. Tickets, autographs, a chance to be on the show. The letter from the 9-year-old in Cincinnati wanted none of those things. She wanted to give him something. And what she gave him, in 4 handwritten pages, changed the way Carson ended every show for the rest of his career. It was April 3rd, 1976. The Tonight Show had been running for 14 years under Carson's tenure, and in that time, the volume of mail addressed to the show had become its own logistical enterprise. Thousands of letters arrived every week, from fans, from aspiring performers, from people who wanted to share a story or lodge a complaint or simply communicate with the man they had been watching every night for a decade. Patricia Vargas managed this correspondence with a system that had been refined across the years to handle the volume without losing the substance. Letters were read, categorized, and routed according to criteria that Vargas had developed in collaboration with Carson, criteria that had, over time, become precise enough to function almost automatically. Almost. There were still letters that required a human judgment about which category they belonged to, and it was in this space that Vargas exercised a discretion that Carson trusted entirely. The letter from Cincinnati arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March. It was addressed to Johnny Carson personally, written in the careful cursive of a child who had been taught to form her letters with attention and had applied that teaching with visible effort. The envelope was pale blue. The return address was in Cincinnati, Ohio. Vargas read it that morning and held it for 3 days before she placed it on Carson's desk. The girl's name was Margaret Ellen Kowalski. She was 9 years old. She had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia the previous August and had been in treatment at Cincinnati Children's Hospital since September. Chemotherapy, which had taken her hair and a significant portion of her body weight, and which her parents had been told was working, but not quickly enough to provide the certainty they needed. The prognosis, as communicated to her parents by the oncology team, was cautiously optimistic, but not definitive. Margaret herself had been told, in the careful language that doctors use with 9-year-olds, that she was sick, and that the medicine was helping, and that she needed to keep being brave. Margaret had been watching The Tonight Show with her mother since she came home from the hospital each day. This was not a planned activity. It had begun accidentally, on a night when neither of them could sleep and the television was on, and it had become a ritual in the specific way that rituals form during illness, filling a need that doesn't have another name. They watched Carson. They laughed at the monologue. They watched the guests. And at the end of every show, Margaret's mother would help her back to her room and they would say goodnight. Margaret wrote to Carson because she wanted to tell him something that she didn't think anyone had told him before. The letter was 4 pages long, written in the pale blue of the envelopes inside. Margaret had spent 3 days on it, according to her mother, not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she wanted to say it correctly, and she kept starting over when she felt the words weren't right. The final version began with an apology for bothering him and ended with her name and a drawing of a television set with a stick figure inside it that was labeled, in careful letters, Johnny. What was in between those 2 things was the reason Vargas had held the letter for 3 days. Margaret had not written to ask for anything. She had not written to say she was a fan. She had written to tell Carson something she had decided he should know, that when she was in the hospital and couldn't sleep and was frightened, she thought about his show. Not about the jokes exactly, but about the way he laughed. The real laugh, she wrote, not the one he did for the audience. The one that came out sometimes when a guest said something he actually found funny and his face did something different. She described it with the precision of someone who had been studying it carefully for months. She wrote that it happened in the left side of his face first. She wrote that his eyes changed before his mouth did. She wrote that it lasted about half a second longer than the other laugh, and that you could tell the difference if you were paying attention. She wrote, "I watch every night to see if I can find the real one. When I find it, I feel less scared. I thought you should know that in case you didn't." She also wrote on the 3rd page that she was not asking for anything. She made this explicit and underlined it. She had heard that famous people got a lot of letters from sick people asking for things, and she didn't want to be one of those letters. She just wanted him to know. Carson read the letter on a Thursday afternoon. He read it once, set it down, picked it up, and read it again. His assistant at the time, a woman named Diane Kaplan, who had been with the show for 3 years, said that she had walked past his office during this period and had noticed that his door was closed, which was unusual for a Thursday afternoon when the building was running at normal capacity. He came out of his office 40 minutes later with the letter in his hand. He told Diane to get him a number for the Kowalski family in Cincinnati. She asked if she should go through the standard channels. He said no. He called Margaret's mother, Ruth, that evening. Ruth Kowalski answered on the 4th ring, and there was a pause of approximately 5 seconds, the pause of recognition, the recalibration that happens when a voice you associate with one context appears in another, before she said hello. They spoke for 35 minutes. Carson asked about Margaret, not about the illness but about her, about the letter, about the 3 days she had spent getting the words right. Ruth described it, and as she described it, Carson asked questions that told her he had read the letter with attention. Real attention, the kind that leaves traces in the questions it produces. Before the call ended, Carson asked if Margaret was awake. It was 8:30 in the evening. Ruth checked and came back and said yes. Margaret was awake, and she had heard the phone, and she was sitting up in bed with an expression that her mother described as very still. Carson spoke to Margaret for 12 minutes. The content of that conversation was known only to the two of them and to Ruth, who was in the doorway of the room and heard Margaret's side of it. Margaret's side consisted primarily of yes, no, I don't know, and one extended answer that Ruth said lasted about 45 seconds, and that Margaret delivered with the focused intensity of a child who is saying something important and wants to get it right. After the call, Ruth asked Margaret what Carson had said. Margaret said, "He wanted to know how to find the real one." I told him. Ruth did not ask what instructions Margaret had given him. She understood that this was something between the two of them. The following Monday, April 3rd, Carson did something at the end of The Tonight Show that he had never done before. He did not close the show with his standard sign-off, the pencil tap, the customary exchange with Ed McMahon, the band playing as the credits rolled. He paused before the credits, looked at the camera directly in the way he very rarely did, and said, "There's someone I'd like to say goodnight to tonight. You know who you are." He did not explain. He did not provide a name or a context. He simply said it, held the look for 2 seconds, and then the credits rolled. 14 million people saw it. Most of them assumed it was directed at someone specific in their own lives, a spouse, a parent, a friend, because that was how personal it felt, and how Carson had delivered it, and how the best communications work. The production staff assumed it was personal in the way they assumed most things Carson did that weren't explained. Patricia Vargas knew exactly who it was for. Carson continued the sign-off for the rest of his career. Every night, before the credits, the same pause and the same words. The phrasing changed occasionally. Sometimes it was good night to someone specific. Sometimes it was simply a pause and a look at the camera, but the quality of the moment was always the same. Personal. Direct. As though the 14 million people watching were each being spoken to individually, as though the show had ended and what remained was something smaller and more private than a television broadcast. His staff, over the years, developed theories about where it had come from. Some assumed it was a stylistic decision, a refinement of the sign-off that Carson had arrived at naturally through years of practice. Some assumed it was about a specific person in his personal life, someone whose identity he preferred not to publicize. The production staff, who had been with the show long enough to notice the change, understood that something had prompted it, and that Carson had not offered an explanation and would not be offering one. They worked with this the way they worked with most things Carson kept private, by not asking. None of them knew about the letter from Cincinnati until 11 years later. What none of them knew, and what Ruth Kowalski's 1987 letter revealed, was that Margaret had watched the April 3rd sign-off from her room in Cincinnati. Ruth had described it in her letter. Margaret sitting up in bed, watching Carson pause before the credits, watching him look at the camera, watching him say the words. Ruth wrote that Margaret had turned to her afterward and said, "That's it. That's the one." And then she had settled back against her pillows and gone to sleep in a way that Ruth described as easier than most nights that year. Ruth's letter also contained something that Carson's production staff had not known and would not have known to wonder about. She wrote that Margaret had continued watching The Tonight Show every night until she no longer could. that in the last weeks, when she was too weak to stay up for the full show, her mother would stay with her until the sign-off and then turn off the television. That Margaret had never missed it. That she had watched Carson look at the camera and say goodnight to someone who knew who they were, every night for 20 months until December 1977. Ruth wrote, "She always said it like she was answering. I heard her most nights. She'd say it very quietly back to the television, 'Good night, Johnny.'" In 1987, Ruth Kowalski wrote to The Tonight Show. Margaret had died in December 1977, 20 months after writing her letter to Carson at the age of 10. Ruth had not written immediately. She had waited because she wasn't sure what she wanted to say or whether saying it was the right thing. She waited 9 years, watching the sign-off every night before she finally wrote. Her letter was 2 pages. She described Margaret, the hospital, the letter, the phone call. She described what Margaret had told her afterward, that Carson wanted to know how to find the real laugh, and that Margaret had told him. She described watching the sign-off for 11 years and understanding every night who it was for. She wrote, "I don't know if you've changed it because of her or for some other reason entirely. I think it doesn't matter. I wanted you to know that Margaret saw it the first time you did it, and she said, 'That's it. That's the one.' I wanted you to know she found it." Carson received Ruth's letter in the spring of 1987. Patricia Vargas placed it on his desk without routing it through the standard process. She said afterward that she had read it twice before doing so, that the second reading had confirmed what she thought after the first, which was that this was not a letter that should wait. Carson's door was closed for the rest of that afternoon. He wrote back to Ruth Kowalski. The letter he sent was handwritten, 3 pages, and arrived at her home in Cincinnati 8 days later. Ruth kept it and never shared its contents publicly. She said in a conversation with a journalist several years after Carson's death that the letter was private and would remain so, and that she thought Carson would have wanted it that way. She said one thing about it, that it confirmed what Margaret had told her the night of the phone call, that Carson had asked Margaret how to find the real one, and that Margaret had told him, and that it had worked, and that he had been grateful for it in a way that had not diminished across 11 years. Ruth Kowalski died in 2003, a year before Carson. The letters, Margaret's to Carson, Carson's to Ruth, were passed to her younger daughter, who kept them in the same way her mother had, privately, carefully, with the understanding that some things are complete without being public. Carson ended every show the same way until May 22, 1992, 16 years, approximately 4,000 episodes, every one of them ending with a pause and a direct look at the camera, and a good night that had begun as a message to a 9-year-old in Cincinnati who had written 4 pages in pale blue ink to tell him something she thought he should know. She had given him the real one. He had used it every night for 16 years. That was the whole of it. That was the gift. If this story reminded you that the smallest gifts are sometimes the ones that last the longest, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more untold stories about the legends behind the television, and leave a comment about something small that someone gave you that you've been carrying ever since.